Hey guys, I just want to talk a little bit about Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Well, mainly the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I think for many of us, we identify with Pesach, Passover. As believers, we understand Messiah dying for us and the Lamb and freedom from Egypt and slavery and bondage into life. And in terms of that ritual, there's a lot of connection. We understand that. Often I find that the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for many of us, and to be honest, over quite a few years, I've struggled with getting to the root of what this is all about, and and I think this is also a problem for many people out there. It just seems like it's just a continuation of Pesach, of Passover, um, but in truth, it's more than that. It is about identifying not with that final judgment, but it's about identifying with being the people that were brought out and made kadosh, set apart, and had a life in the wilderness of sanctification. And I would even say it is about us leaving Egypt. Now the problem with that is when I say things like it's about us leaving Egypt, as people who aren't Jewish, it's jarring. Let's be honest. It sounds a little bit like we don't talk that way, and there's a problem with that. And this is also a reason why we struggle with identifying with many things found in the scriptures. So, and the reason is we're not listening to Paul, or we don't have a revelation of what Paul was saying. I'm specifically thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And please take some time and read that. But Paul says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this fact, of this issue, brothers. And what is he talking about? He then speaks to a congregation filled with many nationalities. He says that all of our forefathers, he says our forefathers. He didn't say the Jews. He didn't say those bloodline Israelites. No, it was about our forefathers were in the cloud and the seed, and he speaks about Moses, and he's talking about that generation, the Exodus generation. But there's this element where he says, you need to not be ignorant of this. You belong to this story. And this is part of the problem, is that we'll often say, well, when the Jews came out of Egypt. Rather, we should say when Israel came out of Egypt, and have the true understanding of the grandeur or the greater prophetic vision of what Israel was meant to be, rather than excluding ourselves and say, oh, it's Jewish. And this is part of the problem. So, and this goes back to Genesis chapter 35. Again, look it up. Verse 10 and 11, where Jacob is given the name Israel. And then he says there, out of you, Israel, will be a nation, okay, which I believe refers to the Jewish nation that we've come to understand. And then he also says, and a company of nations, in plural. That was always meant to be the great vision of who Israel was meant to be. And so we were meant to identify. Paul says, don't be ignorant, identify with that generation. So if you can do that, then you should identify we are that Exodus twice in the year. The calendar surrounds this issue of becoming the Exodus people. And why I say that is, firstly, now in the first month, as we're heading up to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Israel went from having puffy bread, nice bread, and ovens that they could bake all their bread in. But because of the rush and the journey and being a nomadic people, they went down to flat, unleavened bread, like pancakes and rotis and all those, and what they call the bread of Bedouins. Basically went down, humbled into that form while they were wandering in the wilderness, and they couldn't get their houses set up for and building ovens and that kind of stuff. So we remember this part of their journey. This exact same thing happens 6 months later. In the 7th month, we have what's called the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, it's a feast, but also we remember, and it says in the text that we remember that we went from houses, buildings, nice houses, down to shacks and shelters, and they had to take whatever tents they had, and they had to try and put together whatever kind of dwelling they could live in. But again, it's about that Exodus journey and identifying with it. Now, the Christian tradition, we struggle with this, but on some level, I think we've understood that these are important matters to grasp. I think of a lot of Negro spirituals that will often speak about Jordan and crossing over Jordan and finding the promised land, and these kind of stories we've understood. Are we the Joshua and Calebs that go into our promises, or those a whole generation that had to die outside? And so we do understand these things. I think of that wonderful hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, Pilgrim Through This Barren Land. That part of the journey, yes, we've been saved by the blood, but there's a journey. We are pilgrims in this land. We are the holy nation that came out of Egypt, and there's a path of sanctification where there's war on our flesh, war on the desires that we desired, and we know that in the same way that everyone grumbled against Moses, it hasn't changed. And so we are reminded twice a year with that generation, can you humble yourselves but have the feast, find the joy, and identify with, wow, we are a redeemed people. Okay, for many of us with our businesses and we're in lockdown and that, is the element where we're being humbled, but there's a feast to be had, there's joy to be had, there's thanksgiving and remembrance, and to be grateful for the things that we have. So I want to encourage you with that, so that you can identify with the feast of unleavened bread, that we need to identify as the holy people, as Peter said, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. And this goes back. Those words came from Exodus, the description of Israel, that as a nation and a kingdom that's being established, we have the joy of partaking in that kingdom, which has Messiah Yeshua as the chief cornerstone. So I want to encourage all of you, please don't say these are Jewish feasts. Please don't say, well, that's just for the Old Testament. Paul says, don't be ignorant. You should be identifying with these things. You should have pastors and teachers that are helping you to understand, hey, this isn't just about them. I'm a part of this commonwealth. So I want to encourage you all with that, and may you have a blessed feast. Amen.